Hello, hello. A very good afternoon. This is afternoon, isn't it? A very good afternoon to everyone. My name is David Harper. I'll start off with a little bit of an introduction and just talk about what we are doing here. If you'll give me just a moment, because I need to make sure I've got my screen where it needs to be. There we go. Welcome to this event. Today, as I'm sure you're aware, is World Suicide Prevention Day, and this is the first in a series of 5 webinars every week that Bipolar UK is putting on, talking about the symptom of suicide thinking and some of the strategies that people who have real lived experience of this issue have learned to try to manage it. Today, specifically, we're talking about how this particular symptom of bipolar affects men. And that's quite a key point because men are a group who are very affected by this and possibly the group, well, quite clearly the group least likely to talk about it and to get help. And historically, this has been a major issue. Thankfully, something that people are now opening up to and starting to open that dialogue. And we'll get a chance to talk about that with some people who have really been a part of this in the next hour or so here as part of this seminar. So I'll start by just welcoming you here. I believe there's a few little bits and pieces that we want to talk about before we get going. And we'll go through that in a moment. But I'll introduce myself first of all. My name's David Harper. I'm a presenter and a journalist. I work for the BBC, for ITV, LBC, and one or two other people. And my story with Bipolar UK started about a year ago when I decided to go public with my diagnosis, which I kept hidden for quite a long time. I was diagnosed about 10 years ago when I was around about 30 after a series of incidents and issues that I'd been experiencing over a period of time. And I've started trying to open up about this and talk about this a bit more. Suicidal thoughts are a part of this discussion, and it's the part I probably find the least easy to talk about, even after opening up and talking on social media and on other broadcast outlets a lot more about my bipolar diagnosis. It's people find it uncomfortable, and it's understandable and natural why people find it uncomfortable. But I have, experienced that symptom as much as many other people have, and there have been at least a couple of occasions in my life where things have got very scary. And I'm not going to go into details, but I've been fortunate that I've had people on hand who've been very good, who've come to my aid, who've helped me out, and circumstances have worked in that way. But we'll get a chance to talk about some of my experiences and some of the other people that were joined by today as we come up. There's a few bits and pieces we're going to talk about beforehand, and I believe there is a welcome slide with some of the info that we're going to go through at the moment, which hopefully you should be able to see in just a couple of seconds. There we are. So we have to get the serious bit out of the way first. And I'll be very clear about it. As we mentioned already, we are going to talk about suicide as part of this discussion. And if this isn't something you feel comfortable listening to, you are more than welcome to leave us, and you can at any point, and that option is always open, and we don't want to cause any issues for anybody or bring people into a discussion that they don't feel comfortable with. You won't be able to unmute your microphone as part of this discussion, and because of the nature of what we're talking about, it is a little bit locked down because we need to be careful about what we're discussing and the way we discuss it. But we will be very open, and we will be sharing our experiences quite seriously. So we are, I'm afraid, locked down to just the four of us for the duration of this. I hope you can deal with that. As part of this as well, the chat function is off because we obviously want to be very careful about what we talk about and what we do expose people to. But we will be doing a bit of a Q&A, as you might expect. And we've had some questions pre-submitted that I've got here, which we'll be talking about later at the end of our discussion. The other important thing to say is if you would like more support based on some of the issues that we've talked about, either during or after the webinar that we are going through today, you can email the support team, the peer support team at Bipolar UK. The address is on your screen now, info@bipolaruk.org, info@bipolaruk.org, and there will be people on hand who can assist you. We also need to tell you that this is going to be recorded, and the recording will be on the Bipolar UK website and sent out to anyone who registers to attend afterwards. So if you want to go back over anything we talked about, or if you want to share this with someone who isn't available to come and join us today, you're more than welcome to do that. We would love you to do that. And as well, as I said, if you or somebody that you care for, or somebody that you know needs urgent support, there is a list of crisis support resources on the Bipolar UK website. It's very prominent there. It is bipolar.org/crisis-support. And you can also, as we say, email on info@bipolaruk.org. So that's got some of the serious bits and pieces out of the way. Very important that we do address all of that, though. So thank you for bearing with me through that. Let me just come out of this a second and move on to just sort of set us off, really. I'm going to introduce some of the people that we've got talking to us. We are very fortunate, alongside myself, to be joined by Nikki Chinn, Nacho Ruiz Hens, and also Jason Smith, three people who have experiences to share. I'll be introducing them to you in just a moment. We'll have a chance to talk to people one at a time and just talk about some of the different issues that we've got. But a few things that I just wanted, by way of kicking us off, to make you aware of, because there are some quite scary statistics involved, because there was a recent Bipolar UK survey, and 90% of the respondents to that survey said they had experienced suicidal thinking in the past 12 months. It's not a nice thing to hear, but it's something that we don't want to gloss over, because it is a very serious symptom of bipolar disorder, and it's something that's affected a lot of people. And the other horrible statistic, 15 to 20% of people with bipolar disorder do die by suicide. 30 to 60% make at least one attempt. These are serious statistics here. These are not nice to hear. And it does demonstrate really what we're up against. By way of being a little more positive, we've also seen some research from the Karolinska Institute, which found that fewer boys commit suicide, or take their own lives, we should say, in Swedish regions where bipolar diagnoses are more common. And the rate is 5% lower in some of the regions where they have the most diagnoses in Sweden versus some of those with the fewest. And I think that demonstrates quite seriously how important talking about this, helping people to get diagnosed and talk about their diagnosis, what a difference that can make. And as this continues over time, that can only improve. And that just gives us an idea of how serious what we're talking about today is. I'll just introduce you to some of the people that we're going to be talking to. So first of all, we're joined by Nikki Chinn, who is a songwriter and record producer. I almost feel I shouldn't be making this introduction, because you should absolutely be aware of some of the work that Nikki has done over the years. Nikki has written for some amazing, legendary names in the music industry. I've got a few here, but this is just scratching the surface. He has written records for The Sweet, Suzi Quatro, Mud, Racy, Smokey, Tina Turner, Huey Lewis and the News, Tony Basil, and many, many more coming right up to the present day. And as part of a songwriting duo with Mike Chapman, has been the recipient of 3 Ivor Novello Awards for songwriting, a Jimmy Kennedy Award for Outstanding Career Achievement, and a quite frankly embarrassing array of accolades. But Nikki has been an ambassador for Bipolar UK since 2020. And interestingly, one of the things I'm quite interested to talk about, because we deal with a lot of people who were diagnosed later in life and within the last kind of 5 or 10 years. But Nikki was diagnosed in 1961 at the age of 16. I hope you won't mind me saying. You can do the maths on those figures if you want to. But it will be a very interesting thing to talk about how this has changed over time, and how differently things were talked about in the 1960s. We're also joined by Nacho Ruiz Hens, who spent 15 years as a renewable energy investor in the Americas, and has now reinvented himself as an author, coach, and entrepreneur. And Nacho was diagnosed in 2020 after experiencing significant disruptions, and has now started writing about bipolar in an effort to raise social awareness and help people who are struggling to find a balance and deeper purpose. And this work has included all manner of things, including a coaching practice, Ignite Elevate, the Bipolar and Powerful program, and also an outfit called Brilliant Bipolars, to provide financial and career transitioning support for people with bipolar who are in between jobs, because it is a tremendous barrier to people in the workplace if you have a bipolar diagnosis. I should also mention that Nacho is very much in the tech entrepreneur sphere and has been developing mobile apps, social networks, other ways to enable people to get help and to connect, which is this use of modern technology is a tremendous way that we can progress in our discussions here. We're also waiting for somebody else to join us. I will give you a brief intro for Jason as well. I don't think he's on the call quite yet. Jason Smith is a barrister from Liverpool here in the UK, who is in his 50s and was diagnosed with bipolar type 2 in 2014 after struggling with low mood and suicidal thoughts for many years, and is now keen to highlight some of the details around this and talk about his diagnosis, and in particular about the stigma around mental illness in the workplace, which is an area that people often find the most difficulty when you're trying to fit in with other people and the way things work. Jason unfortunately isn't with us yet. Hopefully we'll be able to get hold of him at some point, and we'll bring him in a little later on. But we have plenty to talk about. I've talked a little bit about my experiences. As I said, I, along with many people, have first-hand experience of this and of how it can affect people. And I'm very fortunate. I'm one of the lucky ones, as is everyone who's here with us today, because I've been fortunate to have been in a position where people have helped me out, and things have lined up to go my way. And I'm still here today to talk about it as a result. But let's open up the debate now. And we'll start by talking to Nikki. And it's really great to have you with us here for so many reasons. Both creative and relating to mental health. But I just wonder if I could just start by maybe going back to when you first were diagnosed. I mean, what a very different time back then. What was it that took you up to that stage of diagnosis in the first place?
Firstly, it's very good to be here and to meet you. Um, I was I was at school in Bristol. Actually, I was a boarding school, and something relatively strange for the times happened. One of the teachers noticed that I just wasn't me. And going back to then, that was very rare because people were not hip to mental illness at all. And it's actually quite amazing that he noticed something. I was sent off to the college doctor, who readily agreed there was something not right. And I went to a local psychiatrist in Bristol. I always, a sort of funny anecdote, his name was Dr. Early, but by the time I got to him, it was too late. And he recognized I was depressed. He also recognized that I was not well enough to stay at school and I should go back to London to where I lived with my parents. I went back to London, was referred to another psychiatrist who again diagnosed me with depression because there were no signs of anything else. And in fact, I went into hospital with depression at the age of 17, which was not a great experience, I can assure you. Very frightening, and very frightening indeed, in fact. I was given ECT there at a very young age, I would say. And anyway, I eventually came out of hospital. Something else they did in those days was called narcosis treatment, where you were like put to sleep for 2 weeks, if you like, woken up for meals and stuff like that and hygiene, and then go back to sleep. Very primitive now when we think of it. And anyway, I was released from hospital, and shortly after that, I actually got quite high and started running around, spending what little pocket money I had, but spent it all on Elvis records and whatever. And this became very noticeable to the psychiatrist, and he changed the diagnosis to manic depression, what it was called then, now known as bipolar. I think a more suitable term, to say the least. So I was then diagnosed with manic depression. I might add, in those days, the medication was incredibly primitive compared to what we have now. Incredibly primitive. I mean, lithium hadn't been heard of. The antidepressants were very primitive. The antipsychotics for high mood were very primitive. Um, and so medication was limited. In actual fact, tranquilizers were a big part of treatment then, which actually can be quite addictive. You know, Valium was handed out like they were Smarties, Librium, which, as I say, can be quite addictive. Fortunately, I didn't get addicted, but I took plenty of them. And whatever antidepressants were available, along with the ECT, I was even given LSD as an experiment. Everything about around there was also experimental. They knew comparatively little about it as compared to what they know today. It also goes without saying there was a lot of stigma, which actually began at home. My own parents were ashamed.
You
So I
mentioned, can I? I'm sorry to interrupt because it
no,
is
no, by all
fantastic hearing
means
about
do.
your thing. But you mentioned you're being at school and at boarding school in particular
Yes.
at a time of diagnosis. And we're talking specifically about how this affects men. I mean, that I can imagine amongst the people you were in school with was probably not the most receptive environment in those days to somebody with a mental health issue.
Oh no, not at all. I mean, my fellow pupils, some of them good friends, didn't know what was going on, and they didn't they didn't see the change in mood as much as the teacher did. Yeah, they saw I wasn't quite myself, but they didn't connect it with mental illness because
Was that
mental
because you were making
illness.
a big effort to hide it from them?
I wasn't making that big an effort, because I didn't know how to hide it. There's that old saying, fake it to make it. But I don't think I'd become an expert in faking it at that early stage. At that early age, 16, you feel like you feel. And so I wasn't making a great effort to hide it. I didn't know how to. And I think that's why it became obvious to the teacher. The other pupils, well, all they really knew was that one day I disappeared and I never came back. I'd been at boarding school since the age of 6, which I do believe has contributed to the trigger side of my condition. Because I'm one of those people, I don't believe this condition happens on its own. I'm a big believer in psychological and emotional triggers. I've been lucky enough to do a lot of therapy. And I think, boarding school at 6, pretty cruel. Feelings of abandonment. And yeah, so I think it was a trigger. And by the time I got to 16, I was coming up to my A levels. Um, Both my brothers were academically much cleverer than me. And I think subconsciously I did not want to do those A levels. And I
That's really
didn't.
interesting.
Yeah,
Can
and I
we
did.
can we talk a little bit about we've talked about how the sort of symptoms became apparent, but how not just at the time when you were diagnosed, but actually going forward, because I realize that we have to be very self-aware here. And I know people are going to look at this from the outside and say, well, we're talking about a songwriter, a journalist, an entrepreneur, and a barrister. And these are not people who have failed in life and people who've been very fortunate to have had careers. But I mean, we talk a little bit about how it has affected you, not just then, but in the years going forward, how you've experienced this in your life.
Well, I had quite a lot more hospitalization um, from that age of 16, 17. I was in and out of hospital. But I've always been a writer since the age of 8. I was writing poetry. I consider today's pop music is our poetry. It's the equivalent to poetry back then. Our poetry today is pop music. And I'd always been a writer. For an interim period while I was getting better, as one would say. I went into my father's business. It was something I never really wanted to do. And one day, I think I was about 20, 21, I went to his office and said, I'm quitting.
What
Um,
was it? What was it you were doing?
I was going to be a songwriter.
No, no, in your father's business, I mean.
I was in the motor car business. He was in retail motor cars, a company he had started and was successful. He started it in the late 40s, successful business. I went into the business. My elder brother was already in it. I was over promoted, as can happen in families.
Mm.
So that made it even more difficult for me. And then I said, you know what? This isn't for me. I got to get out.
Do you
Um,
think that creative outlet of being in a more creative industry has been a key part of how you've managed this over the years?
I think so, very much so. The hypomanic periods have been very, very useful creatively. But 2 or 3 years ago, I had lunch with a couple of professors from Oxford who specialize in bipolar. And I said to one of them, what has always baffled me is how I write successfully when I'm well. I could understand the hypomanic side. And he said, in my opinion, it's because you have a very, very slight hypomanic side running through your brain at all times. Not enough to make you unwell, but enough to make you creative. And that was an explanation I really needed because I'd never worked out why I could be successful when I was well. Um, it is a condition that, well, I'm not going to use the general we, that I, and therefore I'm not unique, other people can live with successfully. I think I've looked after myself. I've been careful. I actually have done a lot of therapy because I think medication and therapy go together. On the other hand, I acknowledge I've been fortunate enough to be able to afford therapy. I know it's not as available to everybody as it has been to me. And also, I am one of those people who have bipolar, and I do take my medication. And I
Can
know some
we?
people don't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Can we? We talked a lot about some of the benefits and certainly in a creative profession, and I can relate to this entirely myself.
Yeah.
I've always written things and I've always thought about and presented and had that kind of thing. And looking back, there's clearly bipolar has been an element in that, even though I probably didn't realize it at the time.
Yes.
And we've talked quite a bit about some of the benefits that you've had, but I mean, there must have been some of the downside. I mean, we're here today to talk about some of the real dangers of bipolar in men.
Oh well, in the downside, David, I could hardly write my name, let alone a song. Um, and during those downsides, I forgot that I was a successful songwriter. Like I was no good at anything. It stripped me of all my self-esteem and all my self-confidence. I mean, it just stripped me naked. Um, and for me, depression is the darkest place I could possibly be. I've had other illnesses. About 5 years ago, I nearly didn't make it with pneumonia. I tell you, next to depression, that was a pleasure. And at the age of 17, I did try to take my own life. So when we're talking about lived experience here today, I have lived experience. Um,
We're
uh,
being very careful in talking about what we say here, and talking about some of the issues around these occasions. But going back to that moment, did you really feel that that it was something that you couldn't tell somebody about, that it was something that you were dealing with, that there was no other way of dealing with
yes,
those thoughts?
yes. I was dealing with a very deep depression. Um, I had just come out of hospital, um, and I felt there was no other way out. On the other hand, having done a fair amount of therapy, I do now realize it was a cry for help. I now realize that I think subconsciously I knew my brother was going to come home. And indeed he did. Um, and um, so I now realize it was a cry for help, but consciously at the time it wasn't. I meant it in my mind. And so I had a situation where I felt there was nowhere else to go, purely because it was so black. And also, it's important to say at that age, well, at any age maybe, but at 17, it is very, very frightening. You know, I was not an adult. I did not know much about the world. My world was very limited. I've been at boarding school since I was 6. My knowledge of the world was very, very, very limited indeed. So to see no other way out actually was really quite easy.
Mm. It's and what is really interesting, and this your experience and mine are quite similar in this way, without getting into details, and I think there'll be a lot of people for whom this will mean something, that somebody being there or coming along at the right moment was such a key part in the reason why we're still here today. And I think there's a, if nothing else, a clear message. There will be people who've joined us for this event who are perhaps not themselves people with bipolar, but people who are around people and who are in a position to assist. And I think people often don't realize how significant their intervention could be. And it's not necessarily the dramatic Hollywood moment. It could just be a phone call at the right moment, or a
Uh,
cup of tea or a coffee, or just a few words completely unconnected. But that it's, we can't really overestimate how important a moment like that could be.
no, we can't. And if I go forward many, many years, last 20 years, if you like. And I think this is important for me to say. It applies to me, so I'm not going to generalize it. Um, when I get unwell, I invariably have thoughts of taking my own life. I have learned to talk about it. I get it out there. I don't pretend. I don't fake it to make it. I do tell the friends I know can deal with it. And, for me, talking about it means I'm safe.
Nikki, I know we could talk about your experiences all morning, but we do have a bit of a running order to keep to, and we're going to have to move on. But I'm sure we'll come back in and bring you back into the discussion as we go forward. Let's move on and have a chat with Nachos now. Nachos Ruiz Hens, and I apologise in advance if my pronunciation is not ideal. My language skills don't extend much beyond English and profane. But Nachos is joining us as well today. And we gave you a little bit of an introduction before, but just, I mean, for the benefit of somebody who might not have come across you, you've been very active in the business and entrepreneurial world. But let talk a little, if you wouldn't mind, about what led up to you being diagnosed.
Hello to everyone. Just to clarify, my name is Nacho, and that's a very common nickname in Spain. And I'm very happy to be here. In terms of the events that led to my diagnosis, actually, I had a combination, what I like to call a series of unfortunate events. I had a lot of stress at work. A colleague was fired. My company wasn't paying any bonuses that year, so I had to refinance my mortgage. I had stress in my house. We were talking about divorce, my wife and I, at that time, which unfortunately ended up happening. So a lot of things were happening, and because the company didn't pay a bonus and a colleague was fired, and we were 4 people at that level, and I basically had to take care of his own transactions, I tried to fix everything by working extremely hard, and then I didn't sleep. I did 2 all-nighters, not only one, but 2 all-nighters on the same week. This is something I actually describe in detail in my TED Talk. I have a TEDx talk called Living Fully with Bipolar Disorder. So I know right now we just have 10 minutes, but if people want to learn a bit more about my story, I go in detail on the TEDx talk.
Yeah, and I'm sure that would be an interesting thing for people. And actually, this is doing events like this is a big part of what we're talking about in being open about it. Can we just talk a little bit? I mean, I understand the situation you're in, and I think an awful lot of people. I myself am self-employed, so I really can relate to the idea of overwork and just throwing yourself into that in order to try and to make it through. But what was it that led you to get some help first of all?
Oh, well, I didn't have a choice. I experienced my first manic episode, and when people are not familiar with bipolar, they notice something is off. So they try to convince me to go to the hospital, and I didn't want to go. But because I didn't feel physically well, because I had not slept for so many hours in the last week, I actually didn't feel well physically. So I ended up saying, okay, I'll go to the hospital just to have a regular checkup and see that everything's fine. What I didn't know is that I would end up in a mental institution for 10 days. But that is not really when I had suicidal thoughts, which is the topic of today. What happened after I was in the hospital, obviously I was at a high, and then I went to a low. I didn't understand what was going on with me. I was a high achiever, and then I was told that I would need to go to a different job where it wouldn't be so stressful. I did a change to a different job, and then I was fired only after 2 months. So I didn't understand what was happening with me. I felt as if my mind was broken. And eventually I found another job. And this is what triggered my first suicidal crisis. I've had, I would say, two big ones. So in the first one, there's 6 things I learned. So what happened is and I know we want to be careful about the topic, and I don't want to be very explicit, but basically I was going to go to on my way to work the first day, and before it happened, so if it was gonna be on a Monday, let's say 4 days before then, I became very convinced that I was gonna take my own life on my way to work. And I didn't want to do it. I was extremely scared, but I felt as if there was like a natural force that was gonna, make me do something I didn't want to do. So I spent all night thinking about this. I couldn't sleep. And then I woke up crying. And this is when I asked for help. So I woke up crying, and I told my wife that I was falling into a very deep hole and no one could help me. And then she acted very quickly, and she set up a call with a therapist. And the therapist told me 6 things that saved my life, I think. I'm sure they did. But I want to share those 6 things with the viewers and the audience. So the first thing she told me is that just because I was thinking about taking my own life, it didn't mean that I was going to do it. She said, that was the first thing she said. The second thing she said is, you are suffering. You are in a lot of pain, and you want the suffering to stop. this may seem something obvious, but when you're in the middle of that fight, it was good for me to rationalize what was happening. Then she also told me something that was like a breakthrough for me. She said, nobody knows what you're going through. Only you know the trauma of going to the hospital, leaving the hospital, changing jobs, getting fired. Only you know what it feels. And I think, that helped me connect with her, and I kept listening to what she told me. The biggest breakthrough for me was when she told me the idea number 4. She said, you have done anything wrong. What happened to you is not your fault. And I didn't know this at the time, but I was blaming myself for overworking, for not sleeping, because I thought I had thrown my life to the toilet. And that was the first time I realized that I had a blame issue, and I had to stop blaming myself. And that was a process in itself. It wasn't solved overnight, but it's important for people that may feel the same way to remember that we don't choose this illness. It can happen like a mental illness, could be like a physical illness. You don't choose it, and we can only learn to live with it, do our best to take care of ourselves. But we don't have to feel guilty about this. What the therapist told me then was mind-blowing. I was just crying on my pajamas in front of a Zoom meeting, and she said, you are going to become the best version of yourself, which seemed completely impossible. But at the time, I really need to hold on to something. And then she encouraged me to take this job and try, because I was basically 100% sure that I was going to get in the job. I wasn't going to be able to do the job, and then I was going to get fired again, and I wasn't going to be able to support my family. And she told me, if you don't try, you will never know. And all this combination of things that she told me basically were like first aid kit that saved my life and helped me keep going forward.
What I found really interesting about what you spoke about there is that inner conflict that is going on, and I think it's really easy to assume that somebody who's in that situation is just overtaken by it, and actually there is that battle going on inside people that they may not want to go through with what they're about to do, but there's a bigger part that says that maybe you need to. It's a real, it's not nearly as clean cut as some people might think it is.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think as one thing I would like to say about what Nikki was saying before, and this also ties in with my TED Talk, where I talk about radical transparency. And you also did the same thing. You started talking, David, about your condition, in the workplace. And I found that to be liberating. And I do agree that if you're having suicidal thoughts or you feel unwell, being open about it can save your life, as opposed to just faking you're fine, faking you're fine, faking you're fine, and then who knows what you may end up doing.
Was that, I mean, we're talking specifically, I mean, it's interesting because we're talking about Nikki, who was diagnosed while in school, and you're talking about being in the workplace. And I was in a similar situation, being a self-employed person at the time. But is that a difficult scenario? We're talking in particular about the issues of men here. It comes back to that situation of not wanting to admit weakness. And if you are in a high pressure industry, as you clearly were, is there a real worry that, well, this, I've got to be the man here. I've got to be powerful. I've got to be strong. I've got to be on top of it all, and not wanting to admit anything that might detract from that?
Well, I think that's a social component, probably, right? We're brought up like that. Like men don't cry. I barely cried my whole life until I was diagnosed, and then since then I actually cry more now. And I think it's fine, But yeah, I guess to talk about mental health for anybody, but also maybe specifically or especially for a man, can be regarded for some people as a sign of weakness. But I think it's the opposite. It's a sign of strength, precisely because the easy way would be not to show your vulnerability, but you have to be brave to show your vulnerability. And I wanted to say, I know we have just a few minutes. and I want to be efficient about the time. The second big crisis I had was after my divorce, when I wasn't just thinking about one way of taking my life that I couldn't control, which was what happened the first time. The second time, I was in the planning stage. I was planning different ways of ending my life. And how about this? How about that? How about that? No, I don't like that. I don't like that. But I kept thinking about it in a obsessive way, an unhealthy way. And I went to a psychiatrist that was an expert on bipolar and on suicide prevention. And he told me a sentence that also stuck with me. The sentence was, suicide is a permanent solution for a temporary problem. Suicide is a permanent solution for a temporary problem. I approached him with all my issues. My marriage was ending. I didn't feel happy about my life and all those things. And he told me this sentence. And every time I like Nikki was saying, sometimes when you feel unwell, you might go back to these thoughts. So every time these thoughts come back, I go back to that sentence, and I just take it day by day.
I really like that actually as a line. That's because that is absolutely how it is, but it's also absolutely not the way people think of it at that time. It's difficult to break out of that idea that what you're going through at that moment is permanent and there's no way out of it. And actually, that's never the case. There's always a way forward, and to think of it in that way as a permanent solution to a temporary problem just kind of highlights what we're talking about here and how we need to reframe our thinking a bit. I want to bring in, thank you very much for that. I want to bring in Jason, because we are joined by Jason now, and we introduced Jason a little earlier. Jason Smith is a barrister from here in the UK, from Liverpool, in fact, not far from my old neck of the woods, who was diagnosed in 2014, I think it says here. So about 10 years ago, similar.
About 10 years ago.
Similar to my situation, in fact.
But in the position, and perhaps I did miss a bit at the beginning, and one reason was because I was in work and in a prison. I'm not unable to get out.
That is a unique situation amongst us.
Well, most people seem to be getting released today, but it wasn't for the lawyers. But it is a similar position. My first suicide attempt was many years before I had a diagnosis. And I can say now that the difference in perception, the difference in shame between that attempt.
Do you mind me asking how far in advance that was, just in terms of the
There was
time?
about a year gap. If I put this way, it was about, so we're talking 98, thereabouts. First attempt, then a second attempt, then a diagnosis of bipolar. Now, what I can say is this: after the first attempt, it was silence, it was mute, and it's shame. And nobody at that point, and the difference in 20 years is incredible, which everybody, a great many people, have to take credit for. So we have that position where there's a delay and there's shame, and you don't want to talk about it. And the couple of people I did mention it to outside of immediate family just didn't want to know.
At the time, going back to about 1998, that initial situation, presumably you had no idea about your bipolar diagnosis then. What was your thought process then?
At that time, I think, as everybody can say to one extent or another, there are things you can say with hindsight and look back upon and say that was a sign, that was something, that was a symptom, that was something that could have been or should have been picked up upon. But at the time of that attempt, it's easy to say, isn't it? I was overstressed. We've just heard that. And it's that blame. People who are self-employed, people who are bipolar, you push yourself. The mania kicks in, you push yourself. And you can push yourself to a limit or to a level where you lose control. And one of the areas you can lose control of is depression. And it's just how bleak life becomes, how sad life becomes, and how life can manage without you being there.
You said that after that there was a second attempt as well before you got diagnosed. So what was the kind of aftermath of that like? I mean, presumably you weren't in a position to seek help. There wasn't that desire. There wasn't that support.
There wasn't. I did see a psychiatrist after that, and there was a hint of you may have bipolar disorder. but that's all it was. But the second attempt was a far clearer trigger, a far clearer instance where there was something fundamentally wrong, and this wasn't just a passing phase of anxiety or stress or whatever work-related issue it be. So the second one was what led to the diagnosis. Now, I know some people treat the diagnosis differently, but for me, it was a release. It was a relief to have something I could then say, there's a cause, there's a causation element. And that allowed me to talk about it more freely. And it allows me to not have any shame or stigma about dealing with not just bipolar, but the fact that I have attempted to commit suicide twice, because I don't see there being any shame in that. To me now, it is something that was part of an illness. And it was something that at the time was wrong. But it was wrong on the level of morality more than anything else. In terms of my illness, in terms of my perception, that was wrong as well. But what I was doing was right at the time to me and my flawed perception. And we've heard the descriptions already of people who, you know, at the time, is life worth living? Are you in such a hole? Life becomes painful. And that's where we become or move on, I think, to one of the main planks of this conversation. And it's what you can do about it.
I'm really interested in what you say about flawed perception, because that's been a thing I've talked about quite a bit since I went public with my diagnosis. And it's not a perfect analogy, but the best I've come up with by trying to explain it is how, in the sense that you're the possibly the least best off person to judge the situation
Yes.
that you're in. And the only way I can kind of try and explain it is by saying it's like being on a moving train when you're going. You can't judge how fast that train you're going past is going because you're moving yourself, and you're not in a stable enough position to make that judgment. And it's interesting how I think it shows how important that idea of having support and having diagnosis is, because there'll be an awful lot of people out there throughout history who haven't, as you haven't had that help in the first instance where it manifested itself, and may not have been fortunate enough.
Yes. And you go on to the help element. To get the help, you need to have no shame. So you need to remove that stigma and to take that aspect of the diagnosis and of the illness off. Once you move away from that, people can have, once you have less shame or no shame, then you can speak to somebody in the pub, a friend, and say, I don't feel well. I don't feel right. It's the moving train analogy or comparison. People are telling you, this is the speed. This is where you are in the carriage and in the train. People who know you, and people who you can trust. And that might be family, it might be friends. And again, we're talking about male and how males deal with it. There is a difference. There is a difference I've noticed between the 2 suicide attempts and between the last attempt and where I am now, and me being able to speak about it.
What have your experiences speaking to male friends and colleagues been like?
Initially, I was reluctant, and B, people were afraid. It's an odd reaction.
It's almost a conversation stopper, isn't it? When you start mentioning, particularly if suicide's involved, it suddenly just pulls the plug out of everything.
It's almost like it's contagious or it's an illness, and can you just move away? I don't want to talk about that. But as things develop, and again, as things have changed, I can quite happily talk to people, my family, people who I work with. And the more you talk to people, will see things change in you. And people can alert you to changes in you. And people can say, that train is going off the rails, going back to you up. You need to stop it. You need to get off. And it's only with that kind of release of stigma or taking away of stigma that allows people to talk. And that's not just a question of building up an understanding. It's a question of protecting people. It's putting in place safety nets. And if you put it into nets of just saying, if you're lucky enough presently these days to have a therapist or a psychiatrist, a safety net. If you're on medication, take it. It's a safety net. If you have another form of therapy, use it. It's a safety net. If you have family, use it. It's a safety net. And if you have friends who you can talk to who know about your condition, then it's another level of the safety nets. Now, those safety nets will help you when you do feel low, when you're walking down the street and thinking, how will I kill myself or try next time? Do I use a knife? Let's not get too bleak.
Yeah, let's steer clear of some of the specifics, but
you know exactly where I go.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people will relate to that. Just trying to kind of, we've seen quite a timeline from the 1960s through to the present day as about attitudes and people's experiences. You've had that kind of experience over what, 20-25 years. Trying to look a little bit optimistic now. Are things better now when you raise this amongst other male friends and colleagues? Do people shy away a little less now than they did in the 1990s?
Far less. Far less. I now make a point of any case which is long or with there's people I don't particularly know who are involved in that case, to say, I have bipolar. Don't be afraid. And I just want you to watch out, because during this case, if you think I'm doing anything that may seem odd, or I'm ignoring you, or act a bit what you think is odd, there's a reason. I don't go shouting it. You don't go shouting it around to people and say, with a big flag, this is my position. But if people either need to know or want to know, or it comes as part of a conversation, then there's no need to shy away from it.
And I do feel, I think people like the four of us are in a privileged position that we're doing events like this and we're talking about it. And as I don't know if you were here at the very beginning, but I mean, I hid my diagnosis for at least 10 years and only last year went public with it. And there are a lot of people, I mean, that was not wanting to big myself up, but that was a really traumatic, not traumatic, but a really difficult decision. And I didn't find it easy, but I kind of felt that I had to do it. And part of what has kept me on that line is that I know there are a lot of people who, for whatever reason, won't want to be public about it. I've referenced it before, and we have to be self-aware that the sort of careers and industries that the four of us are in, where we're perhaps in a more sympathetic situation, in a more professional environment, that we can get more support. And there are a lot of people in different areas of life where the stigma is still very, very high, and the risk of adversity in the workplace is a lot higher. And I just think if we're in a position where we can talk about it, there'll still be a lot of people out there, for whatever reason, won't be able to make that decision and won't be able to do that. And by sharing our experiences, we can at least kind of provide that information, provide that experience to people who may not be in a position to be as public.
I did an article in whichever paper a few years ago, and it was read by a police officer in a case I was involved in. And he came up to me and said the difference it had made. It was more of a depression element from his and a work-related stigma. But it was immediately the response. And that was purely by chance, purely by coincidence. But it was nice to know just one little newspaper feature was able to give one person help and understanding. Now, I mean,
obviously, somebody in the police, they deal with an awful lot of traumatic situations, and it is that very masculine, very situation where you have to be really strong and you don't want to admit any weakness because you're part of that team.
And he was struggling, and he felt a weakness, and he reads something, and then he thinks, that isn't a fault or a flaw in me. That is something that is part of life, part of work, part of what he has to deal with. But it does show the positive effect of being able to, talk and just address these issues publicly.
And I think that's interesting as well. I think that's the one thing that all four of us has linked our situation, that we've all had to have somebody say to you, this is not you. This is the symptom of a situation that you have been put in, of a condition. You have not done anything wrong here. And I think that's for somebody to hear that, I mean, for me, that was a real game changer, because I think we heard earlier the idea of a diagnosis being almost a bit of a relief, and I was a little bit worried that if they came back and assessed me and said, oh, actually there's nothing wrong with you, I'd have to come to the terms with I was just a bad person. And thankfully Thankfully, that wasn't it. I was almost more worried about not getting a diagnosis than I was about getting it. But it does show the importance of that, of kind of pushing yourself towards that. I'm aware that time is getting on, and I'm really sorry that I've had to cut everybody short today. But I know everyone has an awful lot to contribute, and we are limited slightly on time. And I've got some questions that I want to ask you that have come from that some people have contributed. Because of the nature of what we're talking about, I said earlier, we can't have a fully open Q&A, but we have had some submitted in advance, and I'd like to go through. At the very least, we've got one for each of you that we can hopefully get through in the time. So if I can go back to you, Nikki, first of all, a question we've had in is how has the stigma of suicide changed over the decades that you've been living with bipolar? And of course, for the benefit of people who may not have been here earlier on, Nikki was diagnosed quite some years ago and at quite a young age.
Yes, the stigma of, I mean, as I said earlier, attempted that when I was 17. The stigma around it was enormous. The shame, not so much personal shame as everybody else's shame, family, friends. I actually didn't feel too shamed about it for whatever reason. I was so young, but I didn't really. There was so much to not understand about it. The stigma has changed dramatically. I talk very openly now about my condition. There are not many people I meet that I don't talk about it. I talk about what I did when I was 17. I talk about suicidal thoughts. I talk about being well also. That to me is very, very important. I'm also lucky I'm in a business that really does understand mental health. It would not be rare for me to say to another songwriter, oh, you know, I have bipolar, and the answer would be, so do I. So it's a sort of business that has a lot of understanding. The stigma has changed dramatically since I was first diagnosed. A lot more acceptance, a lot more awareness, a lot more knowledge of what it is. Things are a lot better.
I think, yeah, I don't think it's clear that things have changed a lot. We still have a long way to go, though, and I think we need to carry that curve on. I think. Just turning to Nacho, we've a question that's come in for you specifically, and something I hadn't thought about asking actually. How do you speak to your children about your diagnosis of bipolar and its symptoms? I mean, do you speak to your children about it?
Yes, I do. I mean, they knew. I mean, they're aware that I went to the hospital. And the second time, actually, I was in the hospital for a month and a half because I was very rebellious. So that obviously had an effect and an impact on the family and on the kids. I would say I have made mistakes speaking to the kids about bipolar.
Do you mind me asking how old your children are, by the way?
No problem. They're 14, 13, and 10. 2 girls and 1 boy. So I've made mistakes talking to them because maybe I was too open and I wasn't really taking into account their ages. So basically, once I told them I was writing a book, I'm writing a book actually, a self-help book about bipolar disorder that I hope can help save lives eventually for people that feel helpless. So, you know, they were asking, how can you save lives? Like, you're not a doctor, you're not a surgeon. And I told them, well, you know, so this is the mistake I made. It's anecdotal, but I said, some bipolar people, this is not going to be my case, don't worry about me, but statistically, the same statistics you shared at the beginning of the webinar, like, you know, 15 to 20% of bipolar people commit suicide, and up to that's all I think all I shared. But you know, even though I told them, don't worry about this is not gonna be me, obviously that's what's stuck on their brain. So that's the mistake I made. So right now, the only way I talk to them about these things, if it's serious, is through a psychologist. So they have their own psychologist. I have my own psychologist, and we would need to have that type of conversation guided by experts.
I think it's an interesting point. I think we could almost have another event just on how to talk to children about this, and because I know it's a situation that an awful lot of people will be in. Maybe that's something we could look to in the future.
Yeah.
Not something I'm qualified to talk about, I'm afraid. But and finally to Jason, we'll just
sorry. Just one final thing, since we're very short on time. If somebody else wants to address any other questions, I have an at Nacho Ruiz Hens, my name, on social media. They can reach out, and happy to help.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And just finally to Jason, because we are reaching the end of our time, I'm afraid. But a question that came in specifically for you: how have you managed your bipolar in the workplace, specifically the symptoms of suicide thinking? Are you open about your diagnosis, and how have your colleagues reacted? I think we touched on this earlier, but
we did touch
yeah.
upon it. But in terms of it, the management, you focus upon your work and you be open and you be honest as you can. You don't go flagging it up. But if it becomes relevant, it becomes something to be talked about. It does, and it happens, and you be open, and it helps. I can just give one very, very quick example. I think in the last two or 3 weeks ago, in that wonderful shortage of quetiapine we have, and probably still have, I was in court and I was struggling, didn't feel well, and I explained to a colleague. 2 days later, he sees me to make sure I was well and had my medication and had the quetiapine. That little bit of care, that really helps, just to know that somebody is listening and caring, even though what's the relationship? It's a friend.
That really does show how far we've come, doesn't it? That someone will be that concerned and that invested and do that. That's a tremendous thing to hear. I mean, from my point of view as well, I think the workplace was the place I probably resisted talking about it the most, because being self-employed in a very competitive industry, you're always worried that that they'll want to book somebody else other than you. They might see you as unreliable, but actually, I think being open about it with your bosses and your colleagues, it's better to be maybe judged for that than to be judged for situations where you might not be at your best. At least if you can provide an explanation for it, I think that's a better situation to be in than to have to try and kind of work on through some of the situations you're in. I'm afraid we are out of time, but thank you tremendously to the three of you for joining us, to Nikki Chinn, to Nacho Ruiz Hens, and Jason Smith. Three very different situations, but some fantastic insight and some real experiences. It really, I know this is presenter speak, we say this stuff all the time, but it really has been great to hear what you've had to say and to hear your different experiences and to go into it. And to everyone who's joined us, thank you so much for being with us today. I hope that something that we've said has been of some use. I know we didn't get through all the questions, but I think looking at them, we covered quite a lot of them in what we said. And if only just, one or two people gain something productive from this, I know that we'll be happy we've achieved something here. So I just want to say thank you very much to everyone for joining us. It really has been fantastic. Thank you very much. And just to reiterate, finally, I should say that if you are in need of some support and you'd like some further material after seeing this, there is plenty on the Bipolar UK website. There are places where you can get help and support if you need it, or if you're caring for somebody who needs it, and also email addresses where you can contact some people and get some support there. So it's all available on the Bipolar UK website if that's what you need. But yes, thank you very much for being with us. It's been a really fantastic thing to share our experiences.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, indeed.